for the completion of a PAR or PER. Again, this there's subcategories under this, but this is really the highlights of what needs to be included in a good PER or PAR. Next slide, please. Okay, the highlights of a preliminary engineering report or architectural report. The report itself needs to clearly establish the owner's needs and objectives, and how do we get those satisfied. Again, write this in layman's terms so that anybody can understand it, but clearly identify the owner's needs and objectives and outcomes of the proposed project. With any report, there's going to be alternatives to be evaluated. Again, this is an engineering and architectural exercise. What are our end results, or what are expectations? How do we get there? And a lot of times the alternatives are evaluated based on cost. Not always, but a lot of times they're based on cost. And what's the best product for the owner? How do we get there? What's the cheapest route that we can take and still accomplish their objectives? Within the report, of course, you develop detailed project cost estimates, and this can be based on the income surveys and user agreements, if it's a utility project, and number of connections and so forth. If it's a downtown revitalization project or a housing rehab project or community rehabilitation project, how many participants. Again, this is based on the owner's desired outcomes for their needs and objectives. Again, it goes back to the environmental report. It incorporates any required requirements identified in the environmental report and or permits. It's key to capture those costs in the PER, because that cost is translated into the funding application. And construction cost estimates, of course, are based on similar projects, local projects. And I think a big thing now is what we're seeing, and I think other folks are seeing also, is costs are increasing significantly, and it's very, very hard to determine a good construction cost estimate, and it's changing monthly almost. So it's the engineer's best judgment for any needed inflation and just the bidding market. You know, how's the climate in your area? What qualified contractors do you have? Because these things could take a year, maybe 2 years from conception through construction. So it needs to clearly identify the best detailed construction cost that you can come up with. And of course, all your related costs, engineering and architectural fees. A lot of times the consultants just generally follow what's laid out at DHCD, their requirements for inspection, or the USDA Rural Development Fee Curve is a good example, just to get a good number in there to cover the design through construction. Of course, your inspections, again, permit fees, those can sneak up on you. If there's any required studies, whether it's a bat study or a fish study or anything that historic resources may require, capture these costs here. Administrative cost, DHCD allows for administrative fees to use for PDCs to go out and verify Davis-Bacon wage rates, to administer the contracts and so forth. So make sure you identify the eligible administrative cost here. Legal fees, attorneys are going to be involved, whether there's loan closings, easements, so forth. Even easement cost, if you anticipate land purchases or easements, count for them here also. And bond counsel, if you have any loan component of your project, a bond counsel service will be provided, and anything additional that you may identify as part of the project study. Next slide, please. Establishes an operating budget. Of course, this is sometimes more geared towards a new utility project, or depending on what kind of mixed use, mixed income project you may identify, if it's publicly owned, like a public-private partnership. But assist in establishing an operating budget to see if the owner can effectively afford it? Does it pay for itself? So forth. Life cycle cost. Is the project worth it? Is the payback there? If it's going to cost you more on the front end or on the back end, is it worth doing? So a good life cycle cost is needed typically. Again, clearly define the scope of the project. As an engineer, it's hard not to define it in technical terms. Again, it's just great to identify it in layman's terms, just so anybody can pick up and read the report, understand the project. What do we want to do? How do we accomplish it? And how do we get there as far as funding goes? But it also needs a technical aspect for regulatory agencies or funding agencies to get what they need to effectively fund the project. Of course, recommend a chosen project alternative, which may include the project being completed in phases. And we're seeing this more due to the rise in construction cost. And I think it's important to understand that we don't want to phase just any project that's $100,000 or less. Typically, $1.5 million or more. We see folks phasing projects a lot more often now. A lot of it could be geared towards the available funding at the time. There's a funding strategy that should be identified in this report. How do we effectively phase it in to obtain our goals and complete the project? Again, I mentioned developing a funding strategy, and this is examples, whether it's DHCD, ARC, USDA Rural Development, VDOT, VDH, DEQ. They could all have a key role in the project, depending on the type of project and what you're trying to accomplish. And then develop a project schedule based on the available funding. Again, these could take years to complete, especially if it's a multi-phase project. It could take 2, 3, 4, 5 years, or even longer, just depending on the scope. Next slide, please. And just wanted to touch on the involvement of the consultant through design and construction, whether if it's a DHCD project. Of course, the consultant could be a member of the project management team, attends the monthly project team management team meetings, provides updates on the design, where we are, what's needed for easements, permits, and so forth, develops the detailed plans and specifications for necessary approvals of the funding agency and the regulatory agencies, obtains all necessary permits to complete the project, incorporates, just an example, DHCD contract inserts, or there may be VDH contract inserts, DEQ, and the applicable wage decision into the project manual. They will assist the owner, of course, in advertising the project for bids to get a contractor on board, review the contractor, and making a recommendation for awarding to that contractor, and assist in awarding the contract. They administer the contract on behalf of the owner, interpret the plans and specifications. Of course, they oversee construction, provide the necessary inspections, and they may assist the local PDC or the owner with the required reporting based on the funding that is obtained. And of course, they're there to process pay requests and change orders. Next slide, please. I know that was very quick, but are there any questions? I'd be glad to entertain any questions that anyone may have.
Yeah, please, if anybody has any questions, now's the time. We got Stephen live and in person. So
and I've got just an example here of a PER that we've done. So, just these things could be 1 inch thick, or they could be 3 inches thick. It just depends on the level of detail needed to complete the project.
Yeah, and Stephen, can you speak to that just a little bit about the level of detail and, why some of them may be thicker than others?
Sure. If it's a comprehensive report that's, let's just say, a neighborhood redevelopment project that's going to include, housing rehab, removal of blighted property and utilities, streets, drainage, and so forth. These things can can grow in size because just for a water system, for instance, the local health department does require a detailed hydraulic analysis of your water system. The engineer is tasked to model that. There may be drainage design notes required. Say if VDOT funds the project for any drainage improvements, street, curb and gutter, sidewalk, so forth. And like I said, it all depends on what you're trying to do and how you, if it's a downtown project, you can append these other reports to it, whether it's the economic restructuring plan and so forth. So funding agencies have different requirements, regulatory agencies have different requirements. So these things can all be included in a PER or PAR to make sure you got everything covered for to obtain approvals and funding as needed.
Great. And so we got a couple of questions over here. Doug had mentioned, you had brought it up as well about trying to keep the same consultant, same engineer,
yes,
when you do the procurement. And Town Jared also wants to know some tips on selecting a consultant. So you can tell us both sides of that coin now.
I can. I've been involved in a selection process, as an owner or an owner's representative, and on the consultant side. And of course, the consultant has to be chosen on qualifications and not price. So it's important that the owner identifies the project scope and outcomes that they want in their procurement. What selection criteria do you think is important? List these out and clearly identify what you expect the consultant or the engineering firm to submit as part of their RFP. Of course, then you'll review those and rank as necessary for just based on the proposal, and then you can interview. And that's where a lot of good questions can come up, and you get a good feel for what the consultant's capable of.
Yeah, and when you do your procurement initially, you can set up the advertisement and the RFQ to have additional language that says, okay, if you do a good job and we get funded for a construction grant, we reserve the right to keep you on board as a retainer, and that prevents the grantee from having to go through a whole nother procurement process unless they just want to, if they need to hire a different engineer.
Exactly. And a lot of times that when the engineer writes the report, he has an understanding for a preliminary design that's easier to move into final design rather than another engineer picking it up. So, but yeah, just key language, the owner reserves the right to move forward with the design with the same consultant. This may be for just a study alone, or you may do it just as a general services agreement. If you do a general services RFP, it's very good to include all the requirements of any funding agency you may use. That way they would approve the general services advertisement and selection, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel later down the road.
Right. And Todd Fortune pointed out that references are really important to get and check those references when you are doing the scoring.
Yes.
And reading the RFQs that are presented. Amanda wants to know what the biggest pitfall or misconception is that you see that our grantees need to try to avoid, either when picking an engineer or doing the PER during the planning phase, or even the construction phase for that matter.
Biggest pitfall. That's a tough question. A lot of the biggest pitfalls that we see is with the PER. Maybe the engineer didn't capture everything that they needed to capture. And when you get into design, there's a surprise that pops up that the money's not there to cover. If that makes sense. I mean, everything needs to be included in that report that you can possibly think of. The engineer needs to really think of it as they're going to design it through construction and account for everything they can. So if I had to say that was one of the biggest pitfalls, that would be just not accounting for anything that could come up cost-wise. and it's hard to back up and ask for more money later. It's easier to get it on the front end.
Yeah, and how important is it to have that knowledge from many years past of somebody on the town or the county's side that can help that engineer with design, like, knowing that there was a half-inch water line right there that was put in 50 years ago,
Oh,
and they don't pick it up, on current plans and stuff.
yeah, it's very important to have that history with the owner. We may design it, you may call in Miss Utility, it's not marked. They may have done something 20 years ago that they're the only one that knew that what happened, whether it's a utility project, drainage project or anything. So when you uncover it, there's your surprise, there's your pitfall. So it's great to have a good working relationship with the guys in the field, not just with the town managers or county administrators. The guys in the field will make or break a project because they have the knowledge for you to put on your plans and account for, and even account for the cost in the PER or PAR.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, Miss Utility is not infallible. They don't pick up everything.
No, you're correct.
What's the average cost right now for cost per linear foot of, say, water line? If you're in a downtown project, and also if you're just in a straight up water project out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, a lot of it depends, on the size of water line and the complexity. We're doing a project here. It's going to start here in the next couple of weeks. We're basically putting in about 1,600 feet for $150,000. So it's getting expensive. It's creeping up. We're seeing if it's in the downtown area. I mean, you depending on the size of line, you could see anywhere from $80 to $100 a foot. That doesn't include any of the appurtenances. That's just putting a line in. Sewer, we've seen sewer go sky high. Before I left the consulting world 6 months ago, I mean, we were seeing 8-inch gravity sewer at $130 to $140 a foot. So, I mean, it's where it was 5 years ago, 6 years ago, where it was $30 and $40 a foot. We're seeing things escalating. Of course, American Iron and Steel could be a big thing too. I mean, we saw a 30% increase when most funding agencies went to American Iron and Steel requirements. So again, a lot of it depends on the bidding climate. Do you have qualified contractors in your area? Are they busy? If they're busy, the price is going to come in higher. So if they need to work, you're going to have a better bidding climate. So
yeah, and that's what we're seeing now in terms of the bidding climate. There's so much work out there, and people are covered up, and so they're going to bid high or not at all on your project. So that's one thing you gotta.
Exactly. We've had some small projects, just emergency projects, come up here where we've had some drainage lines fail and so forth, and we were almost to the point where we was begging contractors to give us a price and do the work. I mean, it's scary almost. They're just so busy and have been all year, which is good for them, but as an owner, it's not very good right now.
Yeah, right. Right. How much more time do you have with us, Stephen?
About 10 more minutes or so.
Okay. Got one more question here in the chat.
Okay.
From Todd. He asks, any good recommendations for minimizing the risk of a consultant adding to the scope or trying to add and raising the cost? Or if something comes up during the design phase and the consultant says that wasn't in the scope, are you pretty much stuck with that?
I've seen it yet both ways. If the owner clearly gives the engineer a direction and the engineer didn't account for it, then the engineer needs to eat the cost. Now, if it's something that was outside that from the planning phase, the PER, when it got into design, and the owner wanted it, then yeah, the owner needs to pay the engineer for their services and so forth. But a lot of that is identified in the study, in the PER or PAR. again, clearly define the scope, what's the owner's needs, what's their objectives, and how do you obtain those, and they should account for it. So I'm not exactly sure how to answer that any further.
Well, and two, I'll just add a little bit to that, Stephen, if you don't mind it.
Sure.
You know, it's imperative on the grant administrators that they, you know, we're not asking you to be an engineer, but you need to know enough and have a familiarity with the subject so that you can speak intelligently to your engineer. You may have a brand new engineer who doesn't have the experience and the knowledge base to pick up on all these things. So that's part of what, you know, we want the grant administrators to do, is know what that engineer's job is, and all the things that they need to look for. And you can open a PER, like Stephen said, and it, you know, if it's written in layman's terms and you can understand it, you can say, well, what about this? Why wasn't this in here? So, and hopefully head off some of those problems.
And a lot of things that we see too, Joe, to add to that, is not necessarily a change in scope, but the engineer underestimating the time it takes to complete the project. You know, if he's thinking the project could be completed in 6, 7, 8 months, contractor comes in and says there's no way possible that's going to be 12-month project or 14-month project, then again, they've underestimated their construction administration services, their inspection services, so forth. So does that fall back on the owner? Not necessarily. You know, the engineer really underestimated what was going on, and we run into that more often than a change in scope.
Hey, Joe.
Yes.
Let me just jump in. That was actually my question, Stephen. And just to give you a very simplistic example, I won't mention engineering firms or localities, but we had a project funded by federal dollars in our region. And it was not DHCD, but the funding agency came back unexpectedly and asked for, I want to say it was 2 different revisions to the plans. And I'm drawing a blank on what the specifics were. I think in one case it may have been the engineer thought they had provided what the agency wanted, but the agency came back and when the engineer approached the locality and said, well, this isn't in our scope. We need to execute a change order for extra money. Stuff like that. Or in a case where the engineer, when they're scoping out doing the plans on the project, either they don't miss it or somebody misses it. It turns out you have to do surveys, and the engineer has to subcontract it out. I'm kind of thinking of stuff like that.
Okay. When you say surveys, you thinking environmental surveys or just topographic surveys and things like that?
Surveying lots.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of that should be identified. Of course, the funding agency could change their requirements from year to year.
Mm-hmm.
It's good for the engineer to have a good point of contact with these funding agencies, and you know, participate in their trainings throughout the year, and you can see changes coming. Now, if it changes midstream, I've seen that before. Just funding agency says, this is our requirements now. I'm sorry. Then it's hard to say that the engineers not do some compensation for that additional work. But you know, as far as additional surveying goes, if you're still within the limits of the original project area, it's hard to allow the engineer to have additional compensation. Now, if it's outside of that area because you've asked them to expand the project area, then I would entertain some additional funds for the engineer.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And just real quickly, correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen, but the errors and omissions insurance that is something that the engineering firm should carry to if something like that happens and the bottom falls out.
Exactly. I mean, you have to carry professional liability and an error and omissions policy, and of course you have to prove that there was an error or an omission. Funding agency changes, that's not going to fall under that. It would be just a blatant design miss. If they design something doesn't work, then you have an error and omission claim. But
all right,
you do have protection there.
Yeah. Okay, we've got time for one more. Vicki Porter raised her hand. Vicki? Do you have a question for Stephen? Okay. Maybe she accidentally did it. Anybody else? Stephen, do you have anything you want to add to the?
I appreciate your time. I apologize for being quick. I've kind of got a little bit of a conflict. Another meeting starting here shortly, but Joe, I appreciate the opportunity to speak today, and I hope that I helped in some form or fashion. My contact information is shown on the presentation, so if anybody has any questions after the fact, just feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll get back to you as quick as I can.
Yeah, fantastic. Stephen, really appreciate you coming out for us. Get great information. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
We'll see you.
All right. Take care, guys.
Sherry, I'm going to toss it back to you.
All righty. So we are ending. It's 2:07 right now. We were actually going to have a 10-minute break, and we are due back here at 2:20 to go over the Spotlight project. So we will see everybody back here at 2:20.
Hey, Amanda, are you there?
Yeah.
Hey, it's Keith from James City County. Do you have a second for me?
Hey there.
Hey,